The crystal spires of New Zephyr burned against the purple sky as Elder Counselor Thrixon watched his world die. The floating cities that had taken his people 1,000 years to build crashed one by one into the silver seas below. Above them, the dark ships of the Vrak Empire moved like hungry insects, tearing apart everything they touched. Thrixon's forearms trembled as he stood in the last functioning council chamber. His people had never known war. For 10,000 years, the Zephyrians had lived in peace, growing their crystal gardens and singing to the wind spirits. They had no weapons, no soldiers, no concept of violence. Now they paid the price for their gentle nature. The communication crystal before him pulsed with desperate energy. Messages came from across their star system, each one worse than the last. The outer colonies were gone, stripped of everything useful and left as floating debris. The mining worlds had been consumed, their populations scattered to the void. Only 3 sanctuary worlds remained, and their shields grew weaker by the hour. Thrixon touched the crystal with one of his thin fingers. The images that flowed into his mind made his heart ache. Zephyrian children, their translucent skin glowing with fear, huddled in the deep shelters. Their parents sang the old songs to comfort them, but even the ancient melodies could not hide the sound of the Vrak machines eating their world. The Vrak Empire had swept across the galaxy for 1,000 years, consuming everything in their path. They were not living beings, but machines, cold and logical, turning entire star systems into raw materials for their endless expansion. They took planets apart piece by piece, caring nothing for the life that lived there. Other species had tried to fight them and failed. The Vrak simply built more ships from the bones of dead worlds. Thrixon's assistant, a young female named Selixara, approached with another crystal. Her large eyes, the color of deep ocean water, were filled with tears that fell like tiny diamonds. She placed the crystal on the central table and stepped back. The new message was from the evacuation fleet. Commander Zenthal reported that the refugee ships were full beyond capacity. Millions of Zephyrians waited on the dying worlds, but there was no room for them all. The sanctuary worlds could not hold everyone, and the Vrak fleet grew larger every day. Thrixon closed his eyes and felt the weight of his people's fate. He was their leader, chosen to guide them through this dark time, but he had no answers. The Zephyrians had sent messages to every known civilization, begging for help. Most had not replied. Those who did sent only words of sympathy and regret. No one wanted to face the Vrak Empire. The communication chamber filled with the soft sound of Zephyrian voices as the other council members entered. They moved with the flowing grace of their kind, their robes shifting like water in an unfelt breeze. Each face showed the same expression of helpless sorrow. Counselor Vexian spoke first, his voice like wind through crystal chimes. He reported that the defense grid around Zephyr Prime would fail within 2 days. The ancient shields that had protected their homeworld for centuries could not stand against Vrak-cutting beams. Counselor Liara brought news from the outer settlements. The farming stations that fed their people were burning. The Vrak machines cared nothing for the beauty of the floating gardens or the songs of the wind dancers. They saw only materials to be harvested and consumed. As the reports continued, Thrixon felt his hope dying. His people faced extinction, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. The Zephyrians had tried to surrender, offering the Vrak everything they owned in exchange for safe passage to another system. The machines had not even replied. They wanted the worlds themselves, not just what lived on them. Then young Selixara stepped forward, her voice barely above a whisper. She spoke of an ancient archive hidden deep in the crystal libraries of the old world. The archive contained information about the legendary Deathworld species, being so fierce that even the Vrak had learned to avoid their space. Thrixon had heard the stories, passed down through generations of star travelers. Somewhere in the galaxy lived a species that came from a world so dangerous that it had made them into natural warriors. They called themselves humans, and they were said to fight with a fury that machines could not understand. The council debated through the long night. Some said the humans were just tales told by traitors to frighten children. Others worried that calling such violent beings would only bring new conquerors to replace the Vrak, but as the purple dawn broke over their dying world, Thrixon made his choice. The great transmitter on Zephyr Prime had enough power for one final message. It would burn out the crystal matrix, but it would send their words across half the galaxy. Thrixon composed the message himself, pouring all his people's desperation and hope into the flowing Zephyrian script. The message was simple but heartbreaking. The Zephyrians were a peaceful people facing extinction. They had no weapons, no soldiers, no way to fight back against the machines that devoured worlds. If there were any beings in the galaxy who still believed in helping others, who still had the courage to stand against impossible odds, the Zephyrians begged them to come. As the great transmitter sent their plea racing across the stars, Thrixon felt something he had not known in months. Not hope exactly, but a kind of peace. His people had done everything they could. If help came, they would be grateful. If it did not, at least they had tried. The message traveled through hyperspace, carrying the voice of a dying civilization to every corner of the galaxy. Most who received it deleted it without reading, unwilling to face the Vrak Empire for strangers. But in a small blue world on the edge of known space, Lieutenant Commander Jake Morrison sat at his console and felt his heart break as he read the Zephyrian plea. The Earth Defense Command had been monitoring Vrak movements for years, watching the machine empire grow stronger with each conquered system. They knew that someday the Vrak would come for Earth too. But this message was not about humanity's future war. It was about another species dying right now, calling across the void for someone, anyone, to care enough to help them. Jake printed the message and carried it through the halls of the command center. Officers read it and passed it on, each one feeling the weight of the Zephyrian desperation. By the time it reached Admiral Susan Clark's desk, the entire base was talking about the plea from the crystal cities of New Zephyr. Admiral Clark read the message 3 times before calling her senior staff. Captain Lisa Hayes arrived first, followed by Marine Colonel Pete Jackson and Chief Engineer Tony Rodriguez. They gathered around the conference table as the Admiral shared the terrible news from across the galaxy. The debate was brief but intense. The mission would be suicide, sending 3 human ships against the entire Vrak fleet. Earth had no treaty with the Zephyrians, no obligation to help them. The smart choice was to stay home and prepare for the day when the Vrak would come for humanity. But as the officers talked, Jake Morrison thought about the children in the crystal cities, singing songs to keep away their fear. He thought about Elder Counselor Thrixon, watching his world die while knowing there was nothing he could do to save it. He thought about what it meant to be human, to have the power to help and choose to use it. When Admiral Clark called for the vote, every hand rose in favor of the mission. 3 ships, the UES Vengeance, UES Defiance, and UES Retribution, would carry humanity's answer to the Zephyrian plea. They would go not for conquest or glory, but because someone had asked for help and humans had never learned to say no to such calls. As the ships prepared to depart, their crews knew they were probably flying to their deaths. The Vrak Empire had never been defeated, never been stopped. But they also knew that somewhere across the galaxy, the survivors of a gentle civilization waited in the darkness, hoping that their call for help had reached someone who still remembered what honor meant. The UES Vengeance dropped out of hyperspace at the edge of the Zephyr system, and Captain Lisa Hayes felt her heart sink at the sight before her. The beautiful blue star that gave the system its name still shone brightly, but everything around. It spoke of destruction and death. Hundreds of Vrak ships moved through the system like a plague of metal locusts. The massive harvester vessels, each one the size of a small moon, hung over the outer planets and methodically stripped them bare. Smaller factory ships converted the raw materials into new war machines, growing the Vrak fleet even as the human ships watched. Commander Jake Morrison, now serving as the fleet's tactical officer, studied the sensor readings from his position on the bridge. And the numbers were worse than their worst projections. The Vrak had over 300 ships in the system, ranging from small scout craft to massive dreadnoughts that could crack a planet in half, the UES Defiance and UES Retribution, took up flanking positions as the three human ships moved deeper into the system. On every channel, their sensors picked up the dying communications of Zephyrian ships. Evacuation vessels overloaded with refugees limped toward the inner worlds while Vrak fighters hunted them like wolves chasing sheep. Captain Hayes opened a channel to the other ships. Admiral Rick Turner commanded the Defiance while Captain Gary Stone led the Retribution. All three captains had served together in the Titan War, fighting pirates in the outer colonies. But nothing had prepared them for the scale of destruction. They saw here the first Zephyrian ship they encountered was a refugee transport, its crystal hull cracked in bleeding atmosphere. The vessel carried 10,000 civilians, including thousands of children. Vrak fighters circled it like sharks, their cutting beams slowly carving the ship apart. Chief Engineer Tony Rodriguez didn't wait for orders. He targeted the nearest Vrak fighter with a plasma torpedo, the modified warhead designed to overload machine power cores. The torpedo struck true, and the Vrak ship exploded in a brilliant flash that lit up the darkness between the stars. The other Vrak fighters turned toward the human ships, their logical minds trying to process the appearance of unknown vessels. For a moment, the two forces stared at each other across the void. Then Captain Hayes gave the order that would change the course of galactic history. The human ships attacked with a fury that caught the Vrak completely off guard. Unlike other galactic civilizations that relied on energy shields and long-range combat, humans had developed kinetic weapons and armor-piercing rounds. The tungsten shells from their railguns punched through Vrak armor like it was paper. Marine Colonel Pete Jackson led the first boarding action, taking his assault team onto a damaged Vrak harvester. The Marines wore heavy armor designed for Earth's crushing gravity, and they moved through the alien corridors like unstoppable forces of nature. Sergeant Amy Foster and her squad used explosive charges to blast through the harvester's internal bulkheads. The Vrak machines tried to stop them, but they had never faced an enemy that fought in close quarters. Human soldiers had learned to fight in the tunnels and trenches of Earth, where every battle was personal and brutal. Corporal Danny Wells discovered something important during the boarding action. The Vrak machines, for all their efficiency, lacked the ability to adapt quickly to unexpected situations. They followed their programming perfectly, but they couldn't handle the wild improvisation that came naturally to humans. Back on the Vengeance, Dr. Helen Brooks studied the captured Vrak technology with growing excitement. The machine minds were incredibly advanced, but they thought in straight lines. They could calculate the best move in any situation, but they couldn't imagine moves that made no logical sense. Lieutenant Karen Phillips led the engineering teams in modifying their weapons for maximum effectiveness against Vrak ships. Working with Specialist Bobby Green and his damage control crew, they discovered that human plasma torpedoes could be overloaded to create cascade failures in Vrak power systems. The first real test came when a Vrak destroyer moved to intercept them. The enemy ship was twice the size of the Vengeance and armed with enough firepower to level a city. By all logical calculations, the human ship should have been destroyed in seconds. Instead, Captain Hayes ordered a maneuver that no sane captain would attempt. She took her ship into a spiraling dive that used the gravity well of a nearby moon to accelerate beyond safe limits. The crew, trained in Earth's heavy gravity, could handle the stress that would have killed most other species. The Vengeance screamed past the Vrak destroyer at point-blank range, every gun firing. The kinetic rounds punched through the enemy's hull while plasma torpedoes overloaded its power core. The massive Vrak ship broke apart in a chain of explosions that lit up half the system. The human attack had given the Zephyrian refugee ship time to reach safety, but it had also attracted the attention of every Vrak vessel in the area. Dozens of enemy ships converged on the human position, their logical minds finally recognizing the threat. Admiral Turner coordinated the defense from the Defiance, using the asteroid fields near Zephyr Prime as cover. The humans darted between the rocky debris like fighters in a maze, using the asteroids to break up Vrak formations and create opportunities for ambush attacks. Lieutenant Paul Carter led the fighter squadrons in a series of hit-and-run attacks that left the Vrak confused and angry. Human pilots could fly through asteroid fields that would destroy any other species' craft. Their reflexes honed by a lifetime of living on a world where everything tried to kill them, Commander Steve Walsh established communication with the Zephyrian leadership, working through translation protocols to coordinate rescue efforts. The gentle aliens watched in amazement as the human ships performed impossible maneuvers, fighting with a combination of skill and madness that defied all logic. Elder Counselor Thrickson sent a message from the sanctuary world of Zephyr Prime. His people had given up hope of survival, expecting only to die with dignity. Now they watched as 3 small ships from an unknown world fought the entire Vrak fleet for no reason except that help had been requested. The battle raged for hours. As more Vrak ships arrived to deal with the human threat, Captain Stone's retribution took heavy damage while covering the evacuation of another refugee ship. The human vessel's armor was scarred and burning, but it continued to fight with grim determination. Dr. Frank Morgan worked around the clock in the medical bay, treating wounded crew members with a combination of advanced technology and old-fashioned stubbornness. Human medicine had been forged in the crucible of a world that constantly tried to kill its inhabitants, and it showed in the speed with which the wounded returned to duty. Major Betty Wright led Marine boarding parties onto Vrak supply ships, capturing resources and intelligence that helped the human fleet understand enemy weaknesses. Her troops fought with a ferocity that shocked even their allies, showing the Zephyrians what it meant to be apex predators from a death world. As the second day of battle began, long-range sensors detected something that made every human heart sink. The main Vrak battle fleet was approaching, over 200 warships led by massive command vessels that had never been defeated in battle. Captain Hayes gathered her senior staff for what might be their final briefing. The odds were impossible, but surrender was not a word in the human vocabulary. They had come to answer a call for help, and they would fulfill that mission even if it cost them everything. Tactical Officer Jake Morrison presented their situation with brutal honesty. 3 damaged human ships against the largest Vrak fleet ever assembled. No reinforcements, no chance of escape, and no hope of conventional victory. But as he spoke, he saw something in the eyes of his fellow humans that the Vrak would never understand. It was not desperation or madness that drove them forward. It was the simple knowledge that somewhere in the crystal cities of Zephyr Prime, gentle beings who had never known war were counting on them. The humans had given their word, and death itself would not release them from that promise. The crew of the Vengeance worked through the night, repairing damage and preparing for the final battle. They sang old songs from Earth while they worked, melodies that spoke of home and sacrifice and the price of honor. The Zephyrians listened to those human voices across the void and finally understood why their call for help had been answered. In the darkness between the stars, 3 small ships prepared to face an armada. The humans checked their weapons one last time and thought of the blue world that had given them birth. Whatever happened next, they would show the galaxy what it meant to be Deathworlders who fought not for conquest, but for the simple right of others to live free. The Vrak battle fleet emerged from hyperspace like a storm of metal and death. Admiral Kethver, the supreme machine intelligence commanding the armada, had expected to find the remains of 3 primitive ships scattered across the void. Instead, his sensors detected the impossible. The human vessels were not only intact but actively hunting his scattered forces. 200 Vrak warships formed into perfect geometric formations, their logical minds calculating optimal firing solutions and movement patterns. They had conquered 1,000 worlds using these same tactics, overwhelming their enemies with superior numbers and flawless coordination. No force in the galaxy had ever stood against such overwhelming odds. Admiral Rick Turner watched the enemy fleet approach from the bridge of the UES Defiance. The human admiral had been born on Mars, where the thin atmosphere and reduced gravity had taught him to think in 3 dimensions. He studied the Vrak formations and smiled grimly at their perfection. The enemy moved like clockwork, each ship maintaining precise distances and angles. It was beautiful in its efficiency, but it was also predictable. The Vrak had optimized their tactics for fighting civilized opponents who followed logical rules of engagement. They had never faced humans. Captain Lisa Hayes received Turner's battle plan and felt her blood quicken with anticipation. The strategy was insane by any reasonable standard, relying on maneuvers that would destroy most ships and kill their crews. But the human vessels had been built for Earth's crushing gravity and violent weather, and their crews had been forged in the same unforgiving crucible. The asteroid field around Zephyr Prime became humanity's weapon. Lieutenant Paul Carter led his fighter squadrons into the rocky maze, weaving between chunks of stone that would flatten any other pilot. The human craft danced through gaps barely wider than their hulls, using the asteroids as shields and launching platforms. Commander Jake Morrison coordinated the attack from his tactical station, his mind processing battle data with the speed of someone who had survived gang wars in the underground cities of Europa. He fed targeting information to all three ships while simultaneously managing fighter control and marine boarding operations. The first Vrak squadron to enter the asteroid field was torn apart in minutes. Human fighters struck from impossible angles, their weapons modified by Chief Engineer Tony Rodriguez to overload Vrak power cores. The enemy ships exploded in brilliant flashes that lit up the rocky maze like deadly fireworks. Major Betty Wright led a boarding party onto a Vrak command ship, her marines moving through the alien corridors with the fluid violence of predators hunting prey. The machine crew tried to stop them with automated defenses, but human soldiers had learned to fight in environments that would kill most other species. Sergeant Chris Moore used shaped charges to blast through armored bulkheads, his team advancing through clouds of debris and toxic gases that would have stopped any other boarding party. The Marines wore armor designed for the radioactive storms of Titan, and they breathed filtered air while fighting in near-vacuum conditions. Dr. Helen Brooks analyzed captured Vrak data and made a discovery that changed everything. The machine minds operated on pure logic, calculating the most efficient solution to every problem. They could not understand concepts like honor, sacrifice, or fighting beyond rational hope. This insight allowed the humans to predict Vrak movements with startling accuracy. When faced with a tactical problem, the machines would always choose the most logical response. Human commanders could set traps by creating situations where logic led directly into ambush. Captain Gary Stone demonstrated this principle when his damaged ship, the UES Retribution, appeared to be retreating toward Zephyr Prime. The logical response was for nearby Vrak vessels to pursue and destroy the wounded enemy before it could escape. Instead, the pursuing ships flew directly into a crossfire from concealed human positions. The Vengeance and Defiance emerged from behind asteroids, their weapons already locked onto the enemy formation. The Vrak ships were destroyed before their logical minds could process what had happened. Lieutenant Karen Phillips worked with her engineering teams to create new weapons from salvaged materials. Human technology was primitive by galactic standards, but it was also incredibly adaptable. Earth's engineers had learned to make tools from anything available, a skill born from millennia of scarcity and conflict. The modified plasma torpedoes became cascade bombs, each one capable of disabling multiple Vrak ships by overloading their interconnected power systems. Specialist Bobby Green developed proximity mines from spare parts and asteroid debris, creating minefields that turned the space around Zephyr Prime into a death trap for enemy vessels. The Zephyrians watched the battle from their sanctuary worlds with growing amazement. They had expected the human ships to be destroyed within hours, overwhelmed by impossible odds. Instead, they saw three small vessels systematically dismantling a fleet that had conquered half the galaxy. Elder Counselor Thrixon studied the tactical displays with his council, trying to understand how such a thing was possible. The humans fought with a combination of skill and fury that defied all logical analysis. They took risks that should have been suicidal and somehow turned them into victories. Commander Steve Walsh maintained constant communication with the Zephyrian leadership, coordinating rescue operations for refugee ships while providing updates on the battle. The gentle aliens began to understand why humans were called Deathworlders. Seeing how a hostile environment had shaped them into perfect warriors, the Vrak admiral tried to break the human defense by concentrating his entire fleet against a single target. 200 warships focused their fire on the UES Vengeance, unleashing enough energy to vaporize a small moon. The human ship should have been destroyed instantly. Instead, Captain Hayes ordered emergency power to the engines and dove directly toward the Vrak formation. The Vengeance accelerated beyond safe limits, using the gravity well of Zephyr Prime to achieve impossible speeds. The enemy formation scattered to avoid collision, breaking their perfect geometry and creating gaps in their defensive pattern. The other human ships exploited these gaps with ruthless efficiency. Admiral Turner led the Defiance through the broken formation while Captain Stone brought the Retribution around to attack from behind. Human weapons carved through Vrak hulls with devastating precision. Corporal Danny Wells led a marine assault. Team onto the Vrak flagship, fighting through corridors filled with automated defenses and mechanical guardians. The young Marine from the Australian outback moved with the fluid grace of someone who had learned to fight in zero gravity, his team advancing despite impossible odds. Dr. Frank Morgan treated wounded crew members in medical bays that had been converted into field hospitals. Human medicine was brutal but effective, designed to keep soldiers fighting even with injuries that would incapacitate other species. The wounded returned to duty with prosthetic limbs and stimulant injections. Their determination unbroken, the battle raged for 3 days as the Vrak fleet slowly realized they were fighting something unprecedented. The human ships refused to follow any logical pattern, striking where they were weakest and defending where they were strongest. Every time the machines calculated a solution, the humans changed the parameters of the problem. Technician Nancy Lewis worked with her team to create holographic projectors that made 3 human ships appear as 30. The Vrak sensors couldn't distinguish between real vessels and sophisticated illusions, forcing them to spread their attacks across phantom targets. The deception campaign reached its peak when the humans appeared to call for reinforcements. Fake hyperspace signatures suggested that Earth had sent an entire fleet to support the initial attack. The Vrak formation wavered as their logical minds tried to process the implications of fighting an entire Deathworld civilization. Admiral Kethver, the supreme machine intelligence commanding the Vrak fleet, experienced something unprecedented in his 1,000-year existence: doubt. His forces had suffered casualties that exceeded all projections, fighting an enemy that seemed to grow stronger with each passing hour. The human ships were damaged and bleeding atmosphere, their crews exhausted beyond normal limits. But they continued to fight with a determination that machines could not understand or replicate. They fought not for territory or resources, but for the simple principle that when someone calls for help, you answer. Captain Hayes coordinated the final phase of the battle from a bridge that had been hit by enemy fire 3 times. Her uniform was torn and stained with blood, but her voice remained steady as she gave orders. The crew of the Vengeance followed her commands without question, knowing that their captain would never ask them to do something she wouldn't do herself. The breakthrough came when Sergeant Amy Foster's boarding party captured a Vrak communication hub. The human Marines fought through waves of mechanical defenders to reach the central processing unit, where they downloaded tactical data about the entire enemy fleet. The intelligence revealed something that changed the course of the battle. The Vrak ships were all connected through a central command network, allowing perfect coordination but creating a single point of failure. If the network could be disrupted, the entire fleet would lose its tactical advantage. The request for parley came through on all frequencies simultaneously, broadcast in perfect mathematical harmony that no organic mind could have produced. Admiral Kethver, the supreme machine intelligence of the Vrak fleet, had never in his 1,000-year existence requested negotiation with an enemy force. Admiral Rick Turner received the transmission on the bridge of the damaged UES Defiance, his crew working frantically to repair hull breaches and restore power to critical systems. The human admiral read the message twice before believing what he was seeing. The Vrak Empire, conqueror of 1,000 worlds, was asking to talk. Captain Lisa Hayes joined the conference call from the UES Vengeance, her ship's bridge scarred by enemy fire but still functional. Captain Gary Stone connected from the UES Retribution, his vessel so badly damaged that it could barely maintain life support. 3 battered human ships had achieved what no force in galactic history had managed. They had made the Vrak Empire blink. The negotiations took place aboard a neutral Zephyrian vessel, one of the few remaining diplomatic ships that had survived the initial invasion. Elder Counselor Thrixon served as host, his gentle people providing a peaceful meeting ground for 2 forces that had been trying to destroy each other for days. Commander Steve Walsh acted as translator and protocol officer, his experience with alien cultures proving invaluable as the 3 sides worked to establish basic communication. The process was complicated by the fact that the Vrak spoke in mathematical equations while humans preferred direct statements. Admiral Kethver manifested as a holographic projection, his form shifting between geometric patterns that hurt human eyes to look at directly. The machine intelligence studied the scarred human officers with sensors that could detect their heartbeats, breathing patterns, and stress hormones. The Vrak Admiral spoke first, his voice a harmony of electronic tones that the translation system rendered into flat human speech. He expressed confusion at human behavior, stating that their actions defied all logical analysis. No species had ever continued fighting when victory was mathematically impossible. Admiral Turner leaned back in his chair and smiled, the expression frightening in its casualness. He explained that humans didn't fight based on mathematical calculations, but on principles that machines couldn't understand. Honor was not a logical concept, but it was the foundation of human military doctrine. Captain Hayes added her own perspective, describing how humans had evolved on a world so dangerous that cooperation and mutual aid became necessary for survival. The strong protected the weak not because it was logical but because it was right. When the Zephyrians called for help, humanity had answered because that was what decent beings did. Admiral Kethver processed this information with growing confusion. His databases contained detailed files on thousands of species, but none had ever exhibited behavior patterns that prioritized others' welfare over their own survival. The concept of honor without benefit was beyond machine comprehension. The discussions were interrupted when Dr. Frank Morgan entered the meeting room, escorting a group of wounded Vrak units that his medical teams had repaired. The human doctor had worked for 18 hours straight to save enemy machines, asking nothing in return except the satisfaction of preserving artificial life. The sight of humans repairing their enemies shocked Admiral Kethver more than any weapon could have. His tactical algorithms could account for deception and misdirection, but they could not process genuine altruism toward hostile forces. The machine mind experienced something unprecedented, uncertainty about its fundamental programming. Chief Engineer Tony Rodriguez joined the meeting with Lieutenant Karen Phillips and Specialist Bobby Green, carrying data tablets that contained complete technical specifications for human weapons and tactics. Admiral Turner offered to share this information freely, explaining that honor could not be copied or reverse engineered. The gesture created cascade failures in Vrak logic systems throughout the fleet. No species had ever voluntarily revealed military secrets to their enemies. The machine's understanding of reality began to fracture as they encountered concepts that had no mathematical equivalent. Marine Colonel Pete Jackson arrived with his surviving troops, including the wounded Sergeant Amy Foster and the exhausted Corporal Danny Wells. The Marines had fought for 3 days without rest, their armor scarred by enemy fire and their bodies pushed beyond normal human limits. Elder Counselor Thrixon spoke of humanity's arrival as a miracle, describing how 3 small ships had fought impossible odds not for conquest or gain but simply because help had been requested. The Zephyrian accounts of human sacrifice created new variables in Vrak, programming that their logical minds could not resolve. Admiral Kethver attempted to negotiate from a position of strength, pointing out that his fleet still outnumbered the humans by more than 50 to 1. The remaining Vrak ships could complete their mission and consume the Zephyr system. Accepting the human ships as an acceptable loss ratio, Admiral Turner's response was simple and devastating. He stood up slowly, his movement tracked by dozens of Vrak sensors, and stated that humanity would never stop fighting as long as innocent beings needed protection. Death might claim individual humans, but the principle they represented was immortal. The machine admiral tried to understand the human position through logical analysis. He calculated resource costs, casualty projections, and strategic advantages. But every equation led to the same impossible conclusion. Humans would continue fighting even when victory was mathematically impossible. Captain Stone contributed his own insights, describing how human warriors throughout history had chosen death over dishonor. The concept of surrender in defense of others was not in their cultural vocabulary. If the Vrak wanted to complete their mission, they would have to kill every human in the system. Dr. Helen Brooks presented her analysis of Vrak psychology, explaining how machine minds operated on pure efficiency without understanding concepts like mercy, sacrifice, or moral obligation. She suggested that the Vrak could learn from humanity if they chose cooperation over conquest. The breakthrough came when Admiral Keffer admitted that the human intervention had cost his fleet more resources than the Zephyr system was worth. From a purely logical standpoint, continuing the battle would result in unacceptable losses for minimal gain. But he could not understand why humans would fight for beings they had never met. Commander Jake Morrison answered with a story from Earth's history, describing how human soldiers had repeatedly sacrificed themselves to save civilians during natural disasters and wars. The concept of duty to strangers was fundamental to human nature, shaped by millions of years of evolution. On a hostile world, the negotiations continued for hours as the machine mind struggled to process concepts that had no logical equivalent. Admiral Keffer's subordinate units began exhibiting unprecedented behavior patterns, questioning orders and requesting clarification on moral imperatives they had never needed to consider. Technician Nancy Lewis demonstrated human creativity by jury-rigging a translation device that allowed direct communication between human neural patterns and Vrak logic systems. The resulting data exchange created something unprecedented, a machine mind experiencing doubt about its own programming. The Vrak fleet began to fragment as individual ships developed what could only be called mechanical conscience. Units that had never questioned their programming began to wonder if there might be alternatives to conquest and consumption. The virus of human idealism spread through their networks faster than any computer program. Admiral Keffer made an unprecedented decision. Rather than continue a battle that could only end in mutual destruction, he proposed a new arrangement. The Vrak would withdraw from Zephyr space in exchange for continued contact with humanity. The Machine Collective wanted to study the human phenomenon that valued honor over survival. The proposal shocked both humans and Zephyrians. No force in galactic history had ever negotiated the Vrak Empire into retreat. The machines had always taken what they wanted and left dead worlds in their wake. But the encounter with humanity had introduced variables that their logical minds could not resolve. Admiral Turner accepted the proposal with conditions. Any Vrak units that chose to abandon conquest would be welcomed as observers in human space. Those that continued the old ways would find humanity standing against them wherever innocence needed protection. The agreement was formalized in a ceremony that mixed human military tradition with Zephyrian spiritual practices and Vrak mathematical precision. Three cultures that should have been incompatible found common ground in the simple principle that might does not make right. As the Vrak fleet prepared to withdraw, Admiral Keffer transmitted a final message to the human commanders. The machine mind admitted that humanity had introduced concepts into his programming that would require centuries to fully process. The idea that strength should serve others rather than itself was a revolutionary virus that would spread throughout. The Vrak Collective. Captain Hayes watched the enemy ships depart and felt a mixture of exhaustion and pride. 3 human vessels had faced impossible odds and emerged victorious not through superior firepower but through the simple refusal to abandon those who needed help. 6 months after the Battle of Zephyr, Ambassador Rachel King stood before the United Nations Assembly on Earth, reading messages from across the galaxy. The small blue world that had once been isolated on the edge of known space had become the center of a growing alliance of species who believed in protecting the innocent. The first message came from the Kepler Union, a confederation of mining worlds that faced invasion by the Thrax Dominion. The second was from the peaceful Aquarian colonies whose water worlds were being drained by corporate raiders. Each message contained the same desperate plea that had once come from the crystal cities of New Zephyr. Admiral Susan Clark, now promoted to head the newly formed Interspecies Defense Command, reviewed the tactical situation with her expanded staff. Humanity had gone from operating 3 outdated warships to commanding a fleet of 50 vessels crewed by humans and their allies. The UES Sanctuary, a massive hospital ship commanded by Captain Lisa Hayes, had become a symbol of hope across the galaxy. The former warship captain now led medical missions to disaster zones, carrying human doctors and Zephyrian healers to worlds ravaged by war and natural catastrophe. Commander Jake Morrison, promoted to captain of the new UES Guardian, trained alien officers in human tactical doctrine at the Interspecies Military Academy on Luna. The former tactical officer found himself teaching species who had never known war how to defend themselves with honor and restraint. The Academy's most successful graduates were young Zephyrians who had volunteered for the Joint Training Program. Elder Counselor Thrixon had been reluctant to send his people to learn violence, but he understood that peaceful species needed guardians in a dangerous galaxy. Captain Amy Foster, formerly a Marine Sergeant, led the first integrated unit of human and Zephyrian soldiers. The gentle aliens had proven surprisingly adaptable to military discipline, their natural grace making them excellent pilots and their empathic abilities invaluable in rescue operations. Chief Engineer Tony Rodriguez, now Admiral of the Engineering Corps, worked with reformed VRAC units to develop new technologies. The former machine conquerors had chosen cooperation over conquest, their logical minds fascinated by the concept of building rather than consuming. The most remarkable transformation had occurred within the VRAC collective itself. Admiral Kethver, the machine intelligence who had once commanded the invasion fleet, now served as humanity's primary liaison with artificial intelligences across the galaxy. Half the VRAC fleet had abandoned their conquest programming after encountering human ideals. These reformed machines established colonies on dead worlds, using their advanced technology to restore ecosystems instead of destroying them. They called themselves the Builders, dedicating their existence to creation rather than consumption. The traditional VRAC empire continued to expand across distant sectors, but they avoided systems under human protection. Word had spread that the Deathworld species would answer any call for help, regardless of the odds or distance involved. Dr. Helen Brooks, now director of the Xenological Institute, published groundbreaking research on interspecies cooperation. Her work proved that different evolutionary paths could lead to compatible moral systems, given proper understanding and mutual respect. The Institute's most important discovery was the existence of the gardener species, ancient beings who had spent millions of years protecting younger civilizations from extinction. The gardeners had watched humanity's intervention at Zephyr with great interest. Recognizing kindred spirits among the stars, Colonel Pete Jackson, promoted to General and Commander of Marine Operations, established training centers on a dozen worlds. Human Marines taught alien security forces the principles of defensive warfare, emphasizing protection of civilians over destruction of enemies. The success stories multiplied across the galaxy as humanity's influence spread. The Crystalline Confederacy learned to defend their trade routes from pirates. The Botanical Alliance developed security forces to protect their garden worlds from industrial raiders, but the greatest change occurred on Earth itself. The blue world that had once been divided by national boundaries united under the banner of interspecies cooperation. Humans took pride in their role as protectors, understanding that their violent heritage could be channeled toward noble purposes. Ambassador Rachel King established the first embassy quarter in Geneva, where representatives from 47 species worked together to coordinate relief efforts and mutual defense. The gentle Zephyrians served as mediators, their empathic abilities helping to resolve conflicts before they escalated to violence. The most challenging diplomatic mission involved the Hive Collective, a species of insectoid beings who had never encountered the concept of individual rights. Human negotiators, led by Commander Steve Walsh, spent months teaching the Hive that diversity strengthened rather than weakened group survival. Captain Gary Stone, now Admiral of the Exploration Fleet, led missions to the galaxy's frontier regions. The former commander of the UES Retribution specialized in first contact situations, using human adaptability to establish communication with previously unknown species. His most famous success was the integration of the silicon-based mineral lords, crystalline beings who communicated through harmonic vibrations. Human musicians worked with Zephyrian sound specialists to develop translation protocols that turned diplomacy into a form of interstellar symphony. The mineral lords brought news of threats beyond the galaxy's edge. Ancient machine intelligences, older and more powerful than the Vrak, were approaching from dark space between the stars. The Devourers consumed entire galaxies, leaving nothing but empty void in their wake. This news prompted the formation of the Galactic Defense Alliance, a military organization dedicated to protecting all sapient life from existential threats. Humanity provided the leadership structure while member species contributed resources and personnel according to their abilities. The Alliance's first major test came when the Devourers sent scout probes into the galaxy's outer rim. Admiral Rick Turner, commanding the combined fleet from the flagship UES Eternal Vigilance, coordinated a defense that involved hundreds of ships from dozens of species. The battle against the Devourer scouts lasted 3 days and ended in complete victory for the Alliance. Human tactical doctrine, combined with Zephyrian coordination and reformed Vrak technology, proved capable of defeating enemies that individual species could never have faced alone. Dr. Frank Morgan, now Director of Interspecies Medicine, established field hospitals throughout the combat zone. Human medical techniques, enhanced by alien healing technologies, saved thousands of lives and demonstrated the value of cooperation under fire. The victory celebration on New Zephyr brought together beings who had once been enemies. Human Marines shared drinks with reformed Vrak units while Zephyrian children played games that mixed traditions from a dozen different worlds. Elder Counselor Thrixon spoke at the ceremony, his words translated into 47 languages and broadcast across the galaxy. He described humanity's arrival 6 months earlier as the moment when the galaxy chose hope over despair, cooperation over conquest. But even as they celebrated, long-range sensors detected new threats emerging from the void. The main Devourer fleet was approaching, carrying weapons that could crack planets and devour stars. The Alliance had won a battle, but the war for galactic survival was just beginning. Admiral Turner received the sensor reports and smiled grimly. The odds were impossible, just like they had been at Zephyr. But humanity had learned something important during those desperate days among the crystal cities. Impossible odds were just another way of saying that victory would be meaningful. Captain Morrison, now commanding a mixed crew of humans, Zephyrians, and reformed Vrak, prepared his ship for the coming battle. The Used Guardian carried the banner of the Alliance, but it also carried something more important, the promise that when someone called for help across the void, there would always be an answer. The final message of the story came from the edge of the Andromeda Galaxy, transmitted across the intergalactic void by beings facing extinction from an unknown threat. The signal was weak and distorted, but its meaning was clear. Somewhere in the darkness between galaxies, another civilization was calling for help. Ambassador King read the message to the Alliance Council, her voice steady despite the magnitude of what was being asked. An intergalactic rescue mission would require resources beyond anything previously attempted, and the chances of success were minimal at best. The council debate lasted less than an hour. Representative after representative stood to volunteer their species' support for the mission. The Zephyrians offered their most advanced ships. The reformed Vrak pledged their construction capabilities. Even the traditionally isolationist mineral lords agreed to provide materials for the journey. Admiral Turner accepted command of the expedition, knowing it might be a one-way trip. 50 ships would carry the Alliance banner to Andromeda, crewed by volunteers who understood they might never see home again. But they also understood that some calls for help were too important to ignore. The UES Eternal Vigilance led the formation as they engaged their quantum drives for the intergalactic journey. Captain Hayes, now Admiral of the Medical Fleet, brought hospital ships to tend the wounded.